Antes de empezar quisiera mencionar el contexto en el cual se desarrolla este conversatorio del día de hoy, con dos invitados que vienen de Sudáfrica. Y quería mencionar que este evento se desarrolla en el marco de la Cátedra UNESCO, a quien agradecemos el apoyo para realizarlo, al doctor Desarrollo, coordinador de la Cátedra UNESCO de Ciudadanía, Educación y Sustentabilidad Ambiental del Desarrollo, y que este evento también es convocado por dos cuerpos académicos, el cuerpo académico de Educación Intercultural y el cuerpo académico de Educación Ambiental también para la Sustentabilidad y Desarrollo, los dos del Instituto de Investigaciones de Educación de la Universidad Veracruzana, a quien también, a la directora, agradecemos el apoyo para la organización, el trabajo realizado para poder tener a nuestros dos invitados el día de hoy aquí con nosotros. Y por supuesto también el apoyo de Luis Mario en todo el trabajo logístico técnico que hay detrás, que también es muy importante para poder tener la calidad, y el equipo técnico también de la universidad, que nos están apoyando para que pueda funcionar este trabajo en dos idiomas. Vamos a intentar hacer un trabajo en dos idiomas, en inglés y en español. Me disculpo anticipadamente por mi mal inglés, que posiblemente tenga ahí algunos errores, no me estén calificando, pero vamos a intentar que sea fluido. Afortunadamente Rob y Esther pues tienen mucha experiencia, y parte de lo que queríamos mostrar en la cátedra del día de hoy era que nos pudieran compartir su experiencia en términos de cómo están enfrentando los retos que Sudáfrica está enfrentando en estos momentos contemporáneos, los cuales son similares al contexto mexicano. Y para empezar me gustaría presentarlos. Los voy a presentar en español. La profesora Esther Kibuka es profesora del Instituto de Estudios del Renacimiento Africano en la Universidad de Sudáfrica. Combina varias disciplinas para proveer solución a los complejos problemas de África desde el paradigma del Renacimiento africano. Es miembro de la Red Internacional de Expertos en Educación para el Desarrollo Sostenible, convocada por el gobierno alemán. Es miembro del programa Fundisa for Change para el desarrollo de maestros, actualmente implementado en Sudáfrica. Por su perspectiva interdisciplinaria, la profesora Esther Kibuka supervisa estudiantes de maestría y doctorado en múltiples campos, tales como el Renacimiento africano, administración pública, ciencia política, estudios del desarrollo, estudios de la salud, ciencias de educación y negocios. Es asesora técnica de las Naciones Unidas, la Unión Europea y de gobiernos africanos en proyectos que incluyen elecciones, salud, específicamente con el caso de VIH, género y educación para el desarrollo sustentable. Es realmente un honor tener con nosotros en esta mañana a la profesora Esther Kibuka. Thank you, Esther, for staying with us today. Y quiero presentar también al profesor Rob O'Donoghue, que es profesor emérito de la Universidad de Rhodes. Él desarrolló sus estudios en Zimbabue, fue maestro de educación primaria, coordinador de educación ambiental en KwaZulu-Natal Wildlife durante 19 años. KwaZulu-Natal es una región de Sudáfrica. Su experiencia en conservación de la naturaleza le permitió completar la maestría en educación, realizando una tesis sobre el desarrollo participativo de un currículum en ciencias. Luego hizo su doctorado sobre el surgimiento de la educación ambiental en el sudeste de África, y su vasta experiencia incluye el desarrollo de materiales para educación ambiental, formación de estudiantes de maestría y doctorado y maestros. Ha sido miembro del programa Fundisa for Change para la formación de maestros y diseño de materiales educativos. Ha trabajado activamente en seminarios auspiciados por UNESCO en materia de educación para la sustentabilidad. Actualmente investiga sobre conocimiento indígena en educación a partir de una red de intercambios con Australia, Japón, India y México. En gran parte de su trabajo ha recurrido a la teoría crítica en educación y aprendizaje ambiental comprometido en su currículum postcolonial y en contextos comunitarios. Es también un honor tener nuevamente a Rob aquí con nosotros en el marco de la cátedra. Y para empezar con el conversatorio me gustaría dar algunos puntos de partida, y para esto entonces intentaré hacer un overview en inglés para poder empezar o iniciar con el diálogo con Rob y con Esther. Gracias. First, I want to start with some overview. I would try to do an overview about the relationship and the characteristic of Mexico and South Africa, and what we share, the things that we are developing here in Mexico. And I want to start why it's important this meeting this morning. Because in Mexico we don't know too much about South Africa, and what we're supposed to know about South Africa is about Mandela, about the apartheid, and especially for me about Charlize Theron. But it's not common to know about South Africa. And one interesting data that I found is that the international cooperation between Mexico and South Africa started 25 years ago. So it's a very recent time these two countries are working together. But the other interesting thing is that we found that the first academic cooperation between two universities within South Africa and Mexico started only in 2012. So it's a very recent time to be working with you, since we have several things in common. What we have in common, what I think that we have in common, Mexico and South Africa have similarities in terms of the richness, and we have a common history of European occupation and colonialism. We have the negative effects of colonialism in terms of how it affects all the scopes in these two new nations. I have the hypothesis that that we have the same challenges regarding this common history about colonialism and European occupation. Regarding cultural diversity, we have in Mexico 64 official languages, but some linguistic scientists say that there are more than 364 varieties of language. And in South Africa, you have 11 official languages, which is a challenge to work with. And we also belong to the list of mega-diverse countries regarding biodiversity, which is also a good point in common to work with. And going deep, we had yesterday a lecture of Professor Esther Kibuka, and I found some similarities regarding political and environmental issues and challenges that we are facing here in Mexico. And I would like to mention some of them. We have conflict areas, especially in these times regarding drug gangs in Mexico. We are, as you mentioned yesterday, we are challenging democracy, and we are having electoral challenges to face. We have also gender difficulties, youth unemployment, educational system that tends to homogenize the diversity, several cases of corruption. Regarding environmental issues, we share the loss of biodiversity also in Mexico. Pollution for open pit mining and oil industry, high rates of vulnerability due to climate change, inequity in access to basic services in terms of environmental justice, as the very basic as food, energy, housing, etc. And we cannot avoid to comment that we are in the same area of what can we do with sustainable development goals. It's international policy that is coming to our countries, and we are agreed that it's a very important option to work with. But is it possible to achieve these goals in our context and with the challenges that we are facing? It's a good starting point also. And I wanted to do just a brief overview. And of course, you know Mexico. You are feeling Mexico, and you know what we are a country that we are facing several challenges. But I would like to give you the microphone in order to to go to your experience regarding education, political, social, environmental topics that you have been working with. And I would like to, the first question is if you can share with us the challenges that you are seeing in South Africa, that you are facing in South Africa now regarding the experience that you have. You can take the scope that you want to talk about and try to share with us the challenges that you are facing. You can select also region, country, or continent if you like to grow that idea.
Because you did speak since yesterday.
Thank you very much for the welcome that we've received here. This is my third or fourth visit to Mexico. And much of the intellectual work that I'm going to report today and that Esther and I are going to discuss has been from the learning in Mexico. And I would encourage many of you, if you can, to visit South Africa so that the learning happens for you in South Africa. And that you're not just hearing it from me, having learned so much and been so enriched by visiting Mexico. The first thing is that we've got a failing education system in South Africa. It's not successfully educating young people. And we are still living in the problems of colonial modernity. I use the concept of colonial modernity because often people talk about colonialism and modernism, but they're connected to each other. And the modern world has produced many problems, but in South Africa we've got all of those modern problems. But we have colonialism, which makes those modern problems even deeper and more difficult. And that's some of the writing that Esther and I have been doing on how can we understand the problems that children have learned in South Africa because of the legacy of apartheid and because of the colonial legacy that has produced difficulties for children to learn. And that's been the main things that I've learned coming from an experience in Mexico. Juan Carlos very kindly acknowledged me in the first paper that I've experienced being written about in a language that I don't understand. So he wrote a paper in Spanish, we had discussed it in English, and then he sent me a copy and my name was on it, which was a big surprise. And subsequently I've worked a little bit in Rio, in Brazil, and learning about Latin American depth of cultural work from Paulo Freire in education in particular. I've just produced another paper on critical theory in South Africa, being informed by the scholarship from Mexico and Brazil. And this has helped us to understand why it is that we need to have greater cooperation between the two countries. Because what I learned and I wrote about, and the papers that I mentioned, we can circulate to you, and you can read them. But what I learned about this paper is that the cultural dimensions of education in a place where you have 65 different languages, where you have intercultural universities, has got a tremendous depth that we don't have in South Africa, because we've had apartheid, we've had different universities for different languages. But here, what the discourses of Paulo Freire enabled was the sense of liberation. So we needed the political liberation from colonialism, but now in our environmental work we need the liberation from all of the problems in the world. But when academics in the North started to write and read with Paulo Freire and out of Paulo Freire's work, they changed the language. And when it came to South Africa, we were reading original Frere work, but when it came as curriculum, they were talking about empowerment rather than emancipation. And there's a big difference between emancipation and empowerment. So when I came to Mexico and I read the scholarship of emancipation, that was much closer to what we need in South Africa than the discourse from the north about empowerment. You know? So the intellectual contribution that is coming out of the Latin American countries is of great intellectual interest to us in South Africa, and was the foundations of some of the work that Esther and I are doing. But we can explore that a little bit later. Is that enough just to open the conversation?
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And thank you, Carlos and his lovely wife, and of course the UNESCO chair. And I also want to acknowledge all of you who are here. Thank you so much for coming. I see my friend over there, Eros. And we are really privileged to be here. I don't know how many of you were not at the lecture I gave yesterday. How many? So that I don't have to repeat. Okay, thank you so much. So yesterday I gave an overview of the Africa as a continent, and I did highlight the fact that we comprise of 55 countries, and we are a continent of great diversity. Contrary to popular belief, Africa is not a country, it is a continent. Therefore, it has diversity of people, diversity of economies, physical, minerals, and so many things. So please, when you think about Africa, do not think about it as just the same. There's no homogeneous population. It is heterogeneous, and everything is diverse, which is an opportunity and also a challenge because of this. So yesterday I painted a picture of the challenges externally we face from the external environment, looking at the geopolitics of today. I looked at the Trump administration and the policies and its effect on the African continent. I also looked at the emerging power blocks coming from the East, namely China and India, and also the problem of the youth bulge, or the opportunity of the youth bulge. Because in Africa we are young, vibrant, energetic, but we are faced with the problem of unemployment. And now, what is it that we should do as the Renaissance? We talked about the Renaissance happening already around us and between us and amongst us, but some of us don't even know that it is happening. Similar to the European Renaissance, we said we also have the arts and the culture going ahead, but what we want to do is to build on the shoulders of what other Africans have done, like Kwame Nkrumah, and who introduced the idea of Pan-Africanism. And because of that, we need to get the African knowledge, the African languages, the Africans to know who they are, the being, because of the past history of colonization, slavery, and so on. We find that Africans have been hurt in a way. So for them to believe in themselves and move forward has been a major challenge. I took the example of South Africa with the apartheid and so on, like Rob has been saying, my colleague here. The problem is indeed very deep. If we look at the education systems within the African continent, many of these education systems were imported by the colonizers. So they were interesting because they did not look at what the indigenous knowledge systems were. Instead, these knowledge systems were subjugated. And what we did was to learn new ways of living, new ways of being. And many, many Africans forgot about what it is to be an African. Thabo Mbeki, the former president of South Africa, wrote a poem, and I want you to Google it. It is called I'm an African. And he presented this. And so you can be able to understand who being an African is. But it transcends putting up the masks on the wall. It's not about the masks. It is about the being. You know, as a human being, you have a body, you have a soul, and you have a spirit. Now, at all these three levels, we have to understand who we are. So when we talk about undoing what has happened to Africa and what the Renaissance can contribute, we cannot forget the idea of decolonization and decolonial thinking. So yesterday I talked about decolonization at the three levels of being who you are at the self, decolonizing the power, and of course decolonizing the knowledge. But that is a very simple division of what the complex issues are. So what we are doing now at the university is trying to transform a university which is supposed to be African, but yet structured upon Western systems. So to decolonize a system of knowledge and people and economy is very complex. However, we have started that journey. So I think that gives a summary of where we are, and I think it will open up much discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther and Rob, for this first round. I can see that you addressed some important conceptual and political aspect of the challenges that you are facing in South Africa. And this, of course, conceptual discussion about empowerment versus emancipation, it's a very fertile area where we can explore about the work of Paulo Freire and how the migration of this perspective goes to Africa, and how you are receiving this kind of perspective about participatory, collaborative perspective and working in the academic field. And of course, Esther, thank you for mentioning about the indigenous knowledge as a subjugated knowledge in the education and also in academic field. And the second round, I would like to go to the question about the how to deal with this situation that you have there, and about educational strategies. And I want to say that it's not education in the very broad sense, not only for teaching and learning, but also in the way that we as universities are producing knowledge, how we are producing knowledge with different strategies, different epistemological perspective and different theoretical approaches. And I would like to ask you if you can share some ideas about the educational strategies or research strategies in the theoretical, conceptual, epistemological, ontological, methodological, about to address these problems and which you have participated in, to share about experience and how you deal with this situation that you are facing in South Africa.
Working from what I learned in Mexico, I did some work on how knowledge came to the South from the North. And we often talk about indigenous knowledge and Western knowledge as if they are something different. And what I'll try to do is highlight some of the intellectuals who have been quite useful in this work, and one of whom is Bruno Latour. And what he describes is how researchers studying the natural sciences came from France, they came to South America, and they worked with indigenous people in South America, and they were working on soil, and they sent the soil information back to Paris, and the scientists worked out about the soils of South America, and then they sent the knowledge back to South America. But it didn't come back to everyone, it came back to just the scientists. So that what happened there was that the scientific knowledge became separated from daily life, and it became the knowledge of experts rather than the knowledge of everybody. And the same thing happened in South Africa. And what Latour calls these is he talks about the idea of convenient simplifications or abstractions. And we think of those today as concepts. So in the curriculum you find concepts like ecosystem or ecology. And we try to teach the children the concept because then it helps them to understand the environment. And the head of the African Renaissance Center at the time actually look at the maize came to Africa through the colonial process. And the people of Africa had sorghum and millet, which of course came to here from Africa with slavery. And sorghum is not a very nutritious grain. It's actually very hard to get the nutrition out of grain. But the way it works is what the scientists call alcoholic fermentation, is releasing the nutrients in sorghum. Because what happens is the bacteria, they break down the carbohydrate and they produce enzymes which releases the proteins, and therefore the food is much more nutritious with the enzymes to digest it. So alcohol fermentation was actually a foreign idea that made Africans seem like drunkards. Because what they would do is they'd ferment the food to feed their children nutritious food. And they weren't fermenting it to make alcohol. They were fermenting it because that is the way that nutrition is released. So that when you start teaching alcohol fermentation with indigenous knowledge, you're actually teaching nutrition. And you say, yes, alcohol is a byproduct. So these kinds of openings are very, very important for us to create new understandings. You know that indigenous people knew how to get food value out of very poor foods. And they also, unfortunately, they did not export the Mexican culture. So we ended up getting diseases from eating maize, because what we were not getting is the use of calcium, you know, which mimics the production of vitamin B, and therefore the vitamin Bs that are associated with the body don't produce the disease of associated with not having enough vitamin B in the diet. So there are all sorts of pellagra, the pellagra that was experienced. And ironically, pellagra was mostly experienced in Europe, in the Mediterranean area of Europe. So that's just a little addition to the story.
Okay, if you have comments or questions, we can start question and answers round now. Si tienen preguntas, Rob y Esther tienen aquí aparatitos para escuchar la pregunta en inglés, perdón, en español.
Yes, I just wanted to comment that it's very important lacking of literature, maybe about these other ways of how people learning. Of course, we have non-formal education. I mean, the education that is occurring outside the schools. And I think that we lack some research and, of course, knowing about how learning occurs outside school. Because we are thinking to, as Esther mentioned before, sometimes this idea that the education occurs only or mainly at the school lead us to say things like that we have to bring the knowledge to the classroom. And I think that we have to promote a more wide sense of education in order to being able to take the classrooms outside the schools. I mean, not being then the classrooms, maybe, but also because there is a big challenge to the schools and universities of breaking this very strong limited idea of how education has to be promoted or learning occur. And then, because in Latin America, because of the big influence of Paulo Freire, his philosophy, popular educators have been noticed that this kind of education must have bring to the university students. And they say by many years they have been knocking the doors of the university to let them come in, but they are, in many cases, these doors still remain closed. So we need to change these things, of course, in every kind of schools, and promoting innovative ways of refer to learning more than education, because most of the times it refers to the schools or the universities. And but in other sense, also, we don't know very much how do the learning occurs among the indigenous peoples, and that is why I thanks that Esther give us this testimony about this approach, the chat and talk. That is, I think, a very more universal way of learning that occurs all over the world.
¿Si hay algún otro comentario o pregunta?
Well, good morning. Thank you very much for visiting us and having this conversation with us. I would like to ask both of you about if you can go a little bit deeper on this difference between empowerment and emancipation. I'm especially interested in epistemological emancipation, which of course goes hand in hand with practice, with this community leadership. And also I would like to ask you if you can give us each one an example of a new abstraction, because it's hard for me to follow that discourse. I am so westernized, and I think most of us are. Thank you very much.
Gracias, señora. Y hay una pregunta. Con estas tres preguntas cerramos una primera ronda y pasamos a...
Buenos días, tarde, días.
Me das nada más un segundo para que se pongan.
Claro. Muchas gracias por su visita a México, por lo que aprendemos en conjunto. Y quisiera preguntar acerca de, en este ejemplo que ponen en relación a la nueva forma de educación, en donde lo local es un básico, es un principio para ir hacia lo abstracto o hacia otros niveles de educación. ¿Qué lugar tienen los expertos locales en el ejemplo que pone Esther con la cerveza, estos productores que generan esos conocimientos? ¿Qué lugar tienen en el proceso educativo? Si tienen algún lugar, ¿cómo es que participan? Y si en esos espacios en donde se generan estas propuestas pedagógicas novedosas, también hay la participación de expertos locales. Entendí que participaban diferentes tipos de expertos pedagógicos, y quisiera saber si los expertos locales tienen un lugar en este proceso de planeación de estas nuevas propuestas. Y también me gustaría saber el concepto de conocimiento indígena, qué es lo que abarca, y si ustedes han observado que pues, existe un conocimiento indígena de diferentes generaciones. Gracias.
Muy bien, gracias por las preguntas. Pasamos.
I've forgotten all the questions already. Because there was too much thinking that your questions provoked. But I'll try to deal with the questions together. And last night I was doing some research on the internet about a book by Steven Pinker, you know, the famous linguist from North America. He's just produced a book called Enlightenment Now. And that's really quite interesting because Enlightenment Now is modeled on the Enlightenment of the West. And I haven't read the book yet, so I'm looking forward to actually reading the book. But I'm a bit worried that he's going to talk about enlightenment empowers. So that if people become enlightened, then they are empowered. But what I'm learning from Mexico is it's not about simply enlightenment. It's about critical reflexive enlightenment. So the enlightenment just doesn't come from learning science. The enlightenment is a sort of like a cultural movement where people think deeply about what they know, they think deeply about the science, and they're able to deal with the problems in the present through their learning. And that is emancipation, isn't it? So you've got an advantage in that when you're reading work like Pinker's, where he wants to now have a re-enlightenment of the world, to actually respond and say, hang on, it's not about just more enlightenment. It's a different form of illumination. You know, it's actually not about the abstractions of the West enlightening the South, but it's much more about communities of people learning together. Okay? And I think that is probably the area that we're looking for theory for at the moment. You know, so if you've got an abstraction like biodiversity, what does it mean? In science, biodiversity is about genetic diversity and it's about species richness. But it's not that alone. It's about the diversity of all living things in the planet. And it's about how they are needed by people, by communities to actually survive. So, I think there still are universal or generalized abstractions that are very important. Whether you're talking about indigenous knowledge or whether you're talking about the biological scientific knowledge, we know that the way people learn is they take an idea and they work with that idea in the world. People who've got grandchildren, like I've got grandchildren now, and I watch my grandchildren. They take a word and they explore the word. They explore it by playing with the words. In poetry, they create their own poetry. And they explore it by actually going and doing things with the words that they've got. So that we know that knowledge descends from the abstract to the concrete, which is a point that Vygotsky made. That knowledge comes to us from others, and then we make it our own. That is a point that Bakhtin made. And we often think about the theories of Bakhtin and the theories of Vygotsky as very different. Because Bakhtin comes from critical literacy, and Vygotsky was appropriated into psychology. But often they're the same thing when you actually take them into the everyday understandings. So yes, abstractions are very important. But critical thinking, which I think is something that Paulo Freire introduced from the South, has still got a lot of work to do. And the intellectual space here in Mexico is an important cultural center where people have learned to work much more together, and they've learned to work much more widely outside of schools in terms of community learning as a collaborative process. I hope that touches on the questions that were raised. We must be very careful not to lose the universals. You know, universals and abstractions are critically important for all human learning.
Thank you very much. I think the comment by Uriel, I think it was a comment, I'll take it as that. It is indeed very important to see how people learn, and of course through the non-formal and the formal ways. We do acknowledge that they will learn through the formal and the non-formal. But what we are trying to say is that rather than the universities or the people who are supposed to be the experts producing a solution, producing a technology or knowledge and taking it to the communities, we are saying now go to the community, find out the need of the community. Find out that need. Go to your laboratory or go to your university and design something that will work in cooperation with them, so that they are co-creators of knowledge, and so that it is not like this top-down process which has been going on for years, where people come in and you don't know anything. Let me teach you. It's now the other way of acknowledging, and that will really take somebody who is humble to accept that I also want to learn, and sit down on a round table or on the floor and learn from these communities. So how do experts now participate? They can participate in two ways. They can be facilitators of knowledge, just like the teacher has now moved from being the professor, the one who knows. Now you move out of that space and co-create knowledge with your students. The students now know more than you, because they are very good at digital usage, they do research, they can see all over the world. So you can no longer be the expert. You have to sit down, get the students around you, and let us talk. You know, and this facilitation has changed the egocentric knowledge gatekeepers of knowledge to really come down and say, now let's co-create knowledge. And I have an experience, my own PhDs. When my PhD student comes and tells me something I don't know, it's time to sign his PhD thesis and let him pass. But so this kind of expert participation, and in fact we have to now be careful about the definition of expert, because that is again a very Eurocentric way of thinking. Because from the Afrocentric thinking, the people who generate knowledge, the people who know, are the older generation. So this part of intergenerational communication is very important. Unfortunately, we have lost the spaces which were learning spaces, and for us in Africa, it was around the fire. I don't know whether you have fireplaces here, where we used to cook outside. So you have to sit around the fire, and you hear stories about how my father did this and how this happened, and all these stories, and using very different metaphors came in. So you could actually understand concepts. And in Africa, we have got the use of proverbs, we've got idioms, we've got sayings, and I think you have had these African proverbs, you know, don't sit on a stone, on a cooking stone. In Swahili, there are sayings that haraka haraka aina baraka. It translates to say hurry has no benefit. Don't always be in a hurry because you're going to lose what you're supposed to do. There are so many things like that. So we have to go back to thinking about this wisdom. And remember, there's a difference between wisdom and knowledge. And this has been many of the problems because our people, our leaders have got knowledge. You have had knowledge, but you don't have wisdom. What is wisdom? Wisdom, for me as a believer, wisdom comes from high above. You pray for it, and you have to think about it and act appropriately and the correct way in the right time. So right now we need wisdom. It goes beyond knowledge. It goes beyond knowledge, and so we have to do that. So what does indigenous knowledge cover? Indigenous knowledge is knowledge which has been generated over centuries, over time. In Africa, it is passed on orally. It's the ways, the values, the systems, the way of doing things. Most of these things are unspoken, by the way. They'll just look at you. And they're like, oh my goodness, that was wrong. They don't even say. So to be able to discern the unsaid, and look through the spirit and just discern things, I think this is what our older generations knew. Because most of the time now, the youth are into the technology and they have forgotten to perceive the unsaid. When you walk into the environment, you can see where there's respect and where there's not. And these are the values we have lost. So what we are trying to do now in South Africa is to introduce the Ubuntu philosophies, the ways of knowledge, the values, respect and so on, between intergenerations. Thank you.
You asked for an example of new knowledge. So if we take climate change, that's a whole lot of new knowledge. And here on the west coast of South America, you have the El Nino, La Nina oscillation of the Pacific. I mean, that's a whole lot of new knowledge. People had El Nino, they had La Nina, and that explained to them problems that happened, in terms of fish harvesting and things like that. But now that explains the climate change in southern Africa. So when we get El Nino effect in South America, we have normally droughts in South Africa. And the city of Cape Town now it's the first city that's going to run out of water in the modern age. But in the ancient times, there were cities in Arabia that ran out of water as well, So it's not really something new for humanity. So old knowledge and new knowledge are constantly happening together. And I think that recognizing new knowledge as something that we need to teach children, and we need to teach through the media. People are not going to get the problem of climate change unless we teach it. But we have to teach it well, and we have to realize that what people use to understand new knowledge is the knowledge that they've got already. So that it's a process of expansion. That's what Engström says. All knowledge and learning is a process of expansion. And Latour calls it orientation and differentiation, deeper possibilities. I constantly try to refer to some of these big names because I know that many of you are researchers, and you can then go to these big names and explore the ideas for yourself.
I think I wanted to just bring one other example. You asked how these things can be done. It's learning by doing. I think we have too much theory into the classrooms, but we have actually to do things. So if you start from the doing, of things, then that is much more easy.
Tenemos tiempo para un par de preguntas más. Si alguien quisiera aprovechar que están Rob y Esther con nosotros. Si no, podemos dar por concluida la cátedra. Thank you very much indeed for your presentation, for sharing with us your ideas, your experience, the links to some readings that it's important to go with and try to explore inputs that you shared with us today. And on behalf of the Institute of Educational Research, of the UNESCO Chair, I want to thank your participation here today. Y gracias al público que estuvo también con nosotros, agradecer a la dirección del Instituto por el apoyo, a Luis Mario por el apoyo técnico, a Lupita como coorganizadora del evento de la línea, el Cuerpo Académico de Estudios Interculturales, nosotros como parte del Cuerpo Académico de Educación, Ciudadanía y Ambiental para la Sustentabilidad del Desarrollo. Agradecemos su presencia. Esther me está solicitando que antes de que nos vayamos, si pudiéramos acercarnos todos para tomarse una foto grupal, porque ella quiere presumirnos, pero antes me gustaría entregarles sus reconocimientos por haber participado en la cátedra. This is for Dr. Professor Esther Kibuka. Thank you for sharing with us. And this is for Professor Rob O'Donoghue, who is already retired. He's expanding the concept of retirement now. Y muchas gracias, entonces, pues, aplauso. Muchas gracias, entonces, si quieren acompañarnos para la foto grupal, porque Esther quiere.